Hey, everybody, this is Drew Burdick with another episode of the Building Great Experiences podcast. With me, I've got my friend, John Espey, who is CEO at Defiance Digital. John and I, a couple years ago, met up through a mutual friend, and we became fast buddies, have had a lot of good conversations over the
Quite
years.
the bromance.
Yeah, quite the bromance. That's right. But super excited I'm having the mix. This is going to be a two-parter, so we're going to do part one, we're going to talk about the impact of infrastructure on great customer experiences, and then part two, we're going to talk about something that both he and I have experienced, which is the transition from corporate life to entrepreneurship. So, John, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, Drew. And I apologize in advance to your audience. I sometimes, when I'm doing these kind of interviews, can get a little off topic. So try to keep me try to keep me honest here. Please.
No worries, man. I'm excited too because I think there's a lot of interesting things, nuggets that are come away from this one. So why don't you tell folks just a little bit about you, your backstory, how you got going, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So I'm 48 years old. I graduated in the year 2000, which was a real interesting time to start in technology. And I started in technology, hands-on keyboard. I went to work for a company that had been a very, very early adopter of Unix. At a time when Unix wasn't being used for a whole lot. And it's interesting because they spent 10, 15 years at the same size installing accounting software on Unix platforms. And the internet came along, and anybody who knew anything about Unix all of a sudden was very valuable because it lent itself very well to web programming in particular. And they blew up. They were sold for, I think, $1 billion before I joined. So I joined one company, accepted the offer in December, and then I walked in July from my undergrad and started a couple weeks later, and they were a different company by then. They were the largest sale of a privately held technology company ever, and they were about maybe 250 people at the time. They were acquired by CMGI. So I got to see some really interesting things as a result of that. I actually got to meet the CEO of that company, who had kind of transitioned it from a 20-person shop to a $1 billion sale to CMGI.
Yeah.
And but I also worked through 6 rounds of layoffs and got to see the dark side of kind of what happens when I don't know how old you are, Drew. I think you're a little bit younger than I am, but we hadn't gotten into Web 2.0 yet, and Web 1.0 was most known for the many failures. Lots and lots of money was thrown in lots of companies. And the CEO of this company in particular said, look, I'm one of the few who's actually made money off the internet because I bill people for doing it. And whether they make money or not, I make money. So it was an interesting time to start a career. It was interesting to see a company that dealing with these crazy dynamics. But I ended up joining a startup after about 3 years with that particular company. And I was a Java developer, started programming in other languages, but started out with Java, which was a very popular language back then. And I've been around consulting and technology ever since then in a couple of different forms. The startup that I joined in 2003, we sold to Red Hat in 2008. I got to spend two years with Red Hat as they were transitioning. Real interesting time to be with Red Hat. I remember being there when they celebrated their first $1 billion in revenue. It took them, I want to say 20 years, maybe less, maybe 15 years to get to $1 billion. And I was there in my 2 years there to celebrate them hitting $2 billion. That's how fast they were growing. And it was interesting to me because Red Hat, I don't think I'm telling anybody's secrets here, had a pretty bad track record of integrating companies that they had acquired up to that point, and for a variety of reasons. But when they made the acquisition of the company that I was working with, I got to meet Jim Whitehurst, who was becoming the CEO of Red Hat, and he's a visionary and did some very, very great things for Red Hat. And he basically said to me, "I've been briefed by the board, and my number one job is not to this acquisition up." And he didn't. He did a great job.
Right.
They kept our email addresses. They let me keep my BlackBerry. I kept it the whole time I was there, but I think it was a good 3 or 4 year transition period. But it was really interesting to see because the Red Hat was shifting. They had shifted from being a primarily Linux company to they had bought JBoss, and then they acquired us as a consultancy to come in and build products. As you're very familiar with your background, JBoss doesn't do anything on its own, and you're selling to a very different audience. And so we were able to be a big part of this transition from really selling to system administrators of Linux to selling to business people who own applications. And the world was shifting, right? iPhone was out, and there were apps, but it was, and there was, we didn't really call it cloud back then. I think Red Hat had a product called grid computing that you would later think of as being more of what a modern cloud architecture would look like. But it was a really exciting time because user experience was becoming very, very important. If you think what user experience meant in a corporate sense before the iPhone and after the iPhone, it's a completely different thing. A user who has experienced Instagram or Uber or any modern application running on 4G or better has a completely different expectation of what their user experience needs to be. And that's before you get into voice assistants and all of these other interaction modes. And so I like to joke, because in 2000 when I started, we were replacing green screens with real shitty web applications. People were thinking about user experience and user interface, but to me it was when the iPhone came along.
Agreed.
And then obviously things transitioned even further as Amazon, as AWS started to become really the computing platform of choice for many, not just startups, but large companies. And I got a taste of that with Red Hat, but more, by 2013, I had started a company called Level that, very similar to what we did with the prior company, but just different computing platforms at the time. And I would say the two main differences from a technology standpoint or from a application development standpoint were user experience had become extremely important, and your deployment environment was completely upended with the introduction of cloud. When I first started doing application development, you would build your code and it would run really slow on your laptop. But you knew that it was going to go onto a Sun E10000 or a cluster of Sun E10000s, and you'd probably get an order of magnitude in performance improvements. Fast forward to when we started Level, by 2016, 2017, the computers that we were developing on were an order of magnitude faster than this ephemeral AWS instance that you were going to be deploying to. And so that's one of the things I like to talk to people about, how things changed from 2000 to where we are now. Dramatically. I think that everybody would agree that cloud computing has been a game changer and has made things operate. It has enabled business models that you just frankly couldn't have without cloud computing. But there is this other side to it, which is, but I'm developing on a computer that's 10 times better than the computer that I'm ultimately going to deploy on and that I'll never see physically and never have any physical access to. So I've given you a lot of my history there, but basically I've been around building digital products my entire career. I'm looking forward to our discussion of making the jump from corporate, because in my story, there's not a lot of corporate there. I spent 2 years with Red Hat, so I think the transition for me was a little bit different than what it might be for a lot of other people. Most of my exposure to corporate America has been being a software provider to corporate America, which is a very different
working
with
working with clients versus being the client, right?
Exactly.
Well, man, you hit on a lot of good stuff. So a couple of thoughts out the gate. Like, you've seen the kind of like changing of the guard, so to speak, over the past 20, 30 years. And as you mentioned, there's been a complete evolution of the infrastructure of the internet, digital products. You also, you touched on the importance of user experience over especially the last 15, 20 years. I'd love to talk a little bit more about like the role that infrastructure plays in user experience specifically, because I think sometimes it gets missed or maybe doesn't isn't something that people think about. They're like, oh, we'll just do the thing, right? And then they forget about the fact that you need the foundation to make sure that it's possible. So anyway, I love your thoughts and reactions.
Well, one thing, I'm sure you've seen the meme where there's a lot of interest in code generation. There has been, whether it's AI generated, whether it's an LLM backing it up, or it's a model that's been pre-programmed, and it's pretty simple to generate pretty basic bits. But I've talked to you many times about using the Cursor IDE and how effective it is at building applications. And I think one of my favorite memes that I've seen is where somebody talks about, this Cursor is a game changer. Check out this new app I made. And then they point you to localhost :3030 and don't understand why it doesn't work. And I think that's a very extreme example of why infrastructure is required. To me, you can think of, I think Maslow talked about a hierarchy of needs, right?
Yep.
And the idea is that there are things that are foundational that really are table stakes, and that if you don't have them, you can't. It doesn't matter how fulfilling your job is if you don't have a home to go to, if you don't have food, if you don't have basic needs taken care of. These are hygiene factors, and I think that at a minimum, infrastructure very obviously is a hygiene factor. Hopefully you can get a little bit further than deploying to localhost port 3030.
Yeah, right.
Hopefully you're a little bit more advanced than that, and it's not that simple. But infrastructure takes there's many ways that infrastructure can enable a good product or can make it impossible to have a good product. Some real basic things, again, if you don't have DNS turned on and nobody can find the application, that's a really obvious example. Less obvious examples are performance. It's very, very easy to build an application but not size it correctly. And anybody who tried to sign up for the Affordable Care Act the first 90 days will tell you, like, maybe I could have gotten on and eventually signed on and actually signed up. But it's a horrible user experience. In their case, the front end was atrocious, and the whole thing was pretty ill-conceived. But the bottom line is, if you can't use an application within a certain amount of time, you're going to have a bad experience. And we measure things now in terms of milliseconds of responsiveness. And again, I go back to my earlier comment. You're used to using Uber. If you picked up Uber and you had to wait 7 minutes before it even told you, you can pick between these Uber X, Uber Pet, Uber XL, you're probably going to go away from it. And in fact, you're probably going to go away from it if it takes more than a second before you see something. That's infrastructure. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate that part of the equation, the speed and the responsiveness. But I think more importantly, but most people can understand it. If you said, hey, go on a site and wait 30 seconds for something. 30 seconds doesn't sound like a lot, but man, if you try to swipe your credit card at Harris Teeter or Publix and you have to wait 30 seconds before you get a response, you're probably going and telling somebody that there's a problem and giving up. You're abandoning the process. I think, and that's pretty obvious to people. They may not understand everything that goes on behind the scenes to make that happen, but it's pretty obvious. I think a less obvious thing is, the way that most products are built today. I want to be careful here because it's not all products, but most products roughly follow an agile methodology or a lean methodology. The idea is we're not going to go plan for 3 years, build a product, it takes 6 months to build it, and then take 2 weeks to deploy it. Or the first project I did in 2000, we waited 6 months for servers to come in from Sun, spent 2 months configuring them, and then it was probably a 2-week deployment process to manually deploy everything onto these servers. If you think about a cycle like that, you have to build products that way. You have to plan far ahead, and you've got to get it right the first time. Well, what always happens when you do that is you miss something. You thought that it needed to zig, but it needed to zag. You thought blue would look better than yellow, or whatever it is, right? There's something that you thought about, you just didn't get it right. And that happens very often in product design. And in the old way of doing things, that's fine. You'd wait another 6 months until the next version of the software comes out, and software just was bad. And I think the biggest reason that software was bad is because it was so expensive to build the software, and we didn't realize that if you find mistakes earlier, it's actually a lot cheaper. And I think we learned that the Japanese taught the Americans that in manufacturing. If break it early, break it often, make it so that we can stop the entire process, get it right before we ship. That wasn't the mindset when I first started doing software, and it very much is now. Now, the way that we build software today, ideally, is you get a product or an MVP or something like a minimum viable product in front of actual users and get their feedback. And it's much, much cheaper to fix it if you haven't gone and built 6 months of software when you say, oh, wow, this never should have been a drop-down box. You can't do that on mobile. It needs to be this way of interacting. If you can figure that out earlier in the process, it's a lot cheaper. Infrastructure enables that. Best practices in infrastructure, modern DevOps, modern automation really enables you to take a different mindset when it comes to building products. And to me, that's more important than scalability. That's more important than responsiveness in the application. This is changing the way that you build applications and allowing applications to evolve at a much quicker pace. We've all seen Facebook was probably the first giant company that was very, very good at doing this. Google does it very well too, but I think Facebook was really the first company who really realized, wow, if we can just push code out and get it in front of users and do real world A/B testing at scale, we can innovate much faster. Yep. And now I think most companies realize that they need to do that, and I think that drives a lot of it. I think there's other things around infrastructure that we can talk about that are very important to the user experience. Compliance, it's not the most exciting thing, but we live in a banking town here, and compliance is very important. I think that cybersecurity, if you have an app that is wide open to all sorts of different threat vectors, your user experience is going to be very bad. But to me, the biggest change is the ability to really make changes in real time, get them in front of your customers, get your feedback, and more importantly, when I need to make another change and get it to fix the things that I've learned, I'm not taking the application down for weeks at a time. One of the first DevOps clients that we ever serviced at Level was a regional bank, and they had a process where when they would get the code done, they would hand it over to their deployment team, and it was 6 weeks to get through. And this is not that uncommon for any bank really at that time. I think now the bar is set a whole lot higher, but this might have been 2015, and we put a process together that enabled. And again, I just want to be clear: this is the code's built, the developers have tested it, the users have looked at it and said this is ready to go, and then 6 weeks later, the
deployment took. So yeah.
And look, there's great reasons that happens, right? You have to have an audit trail. You've got to have. You've got to have certain things looked at and checked.
All the checks and balances.
The checks and balances. One of the biggest challenges from a user experience perspective is configuration drift, right? Like I built this, we made some slight changes along the way, and then all of a sudden one day we go to deploy it into production and nothing works. Or more, if nothing works, it's easy because you can figure that out quickly. But when it starts to fail in real subtle ways because something changed in your configuration, that can be a real pain in the neck. And so when I talk about infrastructure, a lot of what I'm thinking of is really automation, and automation improves the user experience, but it also, in this bank's case, we went from a 6-week process to a 2-hour process. And we could shrink it even more if we needed to. There's a point where there's diminishing returns. I'm sure the technology vendors would love to take it to a minute to 5 seconds. I don't know that the bank is going to pay what it takes to get you there. But obviously, going like that's a game changer in terms of how you build products.
Yeah, I think so. A couple things you hit on. One of the things that I think is interesting is the word infrastructure. Like right now we're talking about it as like the underpinnings of an app, of the digital thing. And I think there's also like experience infrastructure, meaning like you've got to do some homework and some pre-work on like who the people are to ensure that what you're building and what you're structuring is the right thing. So there's kind of this like this really cool partnership between people who do kind of like DevSecOps, infrastructure as code, like thinking about how you architect the thing, basing it on what are the needs of the organization as well as what are the needs of the people who are ultimately going to use it, so that you're architecting it with that in mind. And one of the things that I was thinking about was oftentimes there's this assumption in the US especially that like, oh, everyone has 4G or 5G. Like that's kind of like the common assumption, right? So you build things with that in mind. You build these like really great experiences and you launch them or whatever, but there's a pretty good part of America and the rest of the world that still is on like 2G, 3G, right? Like they're in more remote or rural places where they don't have high-speed internet access. And it basically just fundamentally the thing doesn't work, right? The app doesn't load, the website doesn't load, whatever it is. And you were talking about performance.
Yep.
And so there's this really interesting thing that I a couple of times in my career we've done is where we learn like, oh, this is like a healthcare company and they're serving lots of different people. And maybe it's like, or it's an international company and they have people who are based in more remote parts of the world. How do we make sure that this thing, like what's the stripped down version of this that is like less images, less, scripts running, less, calls, API calls being made, so that you're still delivering the core value to that person, but it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, right? And so I think there's like some of these decisions that you can make when you talk about infrastructure. You can say, all right, what's the level of stuff that's needed to deliver the core value to the in-person user, consumer, employee, whatever it is, and is it 10%, 20%, 50%, 100%, whatever it is. And so then you're architecting it with that in mind. And it's that's where I think there's like this really interesting intersection of people like me, like working with people like you, where we're thinking about, okay, how do we architect this with those considerations? Because it's a lot of times people just like miss that part, right?
Oh, absolutely. I'm nodding my head because the time and again you run into examples of this. The most extreme example of what you're talking about that I've encountered was we did a project for the Department of Defense, for the Marine Corps in particular, and they were dealing with they've got a huge budget, obviously, to start off with. And when you think about the environment that they're operating in, yes, they're in data centers that have fiber optic connections and all the bandwidth that they need, but they're also operating in helicopters flying through Singapore. Maybe there's a Chinese-made cell phone that somebody's picked up at the store that's in there as well. There's just some really, really extremely different environments, and they need a digital experience that works in all of those. And what we were helping them with in this particular case was a reference security architecture that recognized exactly what you're talking about, which is, yes, I'm on the internet backbone in the Pentagon because the internet starts in Northern Virginia, right? And that's great. And I should have one set of security requirements for the developers of applications in that data center. It's a very different thing when I'm in a battle theater.
Yeah, right.
And maybe I don't even have cellular because the enemy operates the cellular network. There's just, you have to be aware. And I think that you can look, they wanted to look to a lot of the things that have been done in the commercial sector because in the 60s, 70s, 80s, technology tended to flow from the military industrial complex to the commercial sector, but it's completely flipped around. And so we were able to get in on a contract that was a result of that. During the Obama administration, they made it easier to subcontract to private industry contractors because they realized there's all sorts of great things going on in the commercial world as we've put all of these banks and retailers online and built security protocols. When you look at some of the greatest cloud frameworks, cloud enablement frameworks, of the early public cloud came out of Netflix, right? Netflix saying this is how we're going to build applications, because they built famously the majority of their infrastructure on AWS very early on, and they realized it was just a different environment than it's a less predictable environment than maybe your own data center, right? And so yeah, I think you make a great point there, and I guess that is just as much of a user experience question as it is an infrastructure question.
Yeah. Which
sure.
I mean, I think that's part of it is, there's all these myriad things you have to think about. And sometimes I've worked in a lot of organizations where, it's somebody at the top has an assumption or an opinion of what the thing is or what it needs or who the people are that they're serving. And they just start rolling, right? And they start, the agile train starts running, 6, 12, 18 months down the road, they're like, oh shit, we didn't even know that most people who are using this are looking at it on like an old operating system on an old computer in a rural area. And like, this is like a weird example, but I worked with a regional bank during COVID, and it's baffling. Their regional bank, they serve most of like rural North Carolina, South Carolina, a couple other areas. And at the time, CARE Act, you mentioned, came out, and they were like, oh my God, we got to go like communicate to everybody what's going on. Well, most of their branches didn't actually have internet access. The way that they communicated, like their internal communications, was they were sending, no joke, mailing VHS tapes to some of these branches that had like zero access to basically communicate with them, like, hey, we're doing this thing, right? Which is just kind of mind-boggling. But, it's people don't think about that, right? They're like, oh, we'll just put out this website and make a form, and they can just fill out their stuff and defer their mortgage payment.
Sure.
And then you're like, wait, how do we tell this?
We don't even have frame relay.
Like we got to literally mail something to people, and that was 4 years ago. That wasn't even that long ago. And so, sometimes the infrastructure part, like you have to keep the context in mind when you're architecting, because if you don't, you'll miss the mark, and then you're like, how did we miss this, right?
Sure. And I'm sure there's some analog in civilian engineering or designing cities where if you don't have big enough roads, or if you don't have rail infrastructure, or you don't have bridges, or you don't, there's all sorts of things that we kind of have to we take for granted. But if you're designing a city and you don't have those things, you're going to have to design around them. And that's why I tell our folks, look, at the end of the day, our decision makers are usually somebody with an engineering management title,
right?
A CTO, a VP of application development. But who I prefer to sell to are the business owners, the people who actually want the products. Sometimes it's hard because we were building, just an example of how technology has gotten so good that it really sometimes harms technology providers. We were building a web-based application that needed to be able to go offline. It was a sales quote tool for home contractors, and there just are going to be times where they're in the mountains and they don't have connectivity. And they would always use Google Maps offline mode as an example. And I had to point out to the client on multiple occasions, what you don't see is the hundreds of millions of dollars that Google has spent developing this.
Exactly.
Hundreds of millions of dollars. Right. Some things are easy. Some things are much easier than the engineers tell you that they are. But some things are difficult because they are difficult. But to me, though, I'd still take any day that consumers have access to great technology because they demand it, and it can be done. It can be solved. We need to make investments. We need to, companies need to make investments in their infrastructure. They need to make investments in their expertise and their ability to build applications. And nothing spurs that more than people having good experiences. But sometimes it's difficult because, well, I can do that on Google.
Yeah, right. They don't fully understand what the implications are. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hey, there's a lot of stuff under the hood that made that possible, man.
yeah. I mean, I'm sure you enjoyed watching Michael Jordan dunk from the 3-point line, and he made it look easy, but it doesn't mean I could go dunk, or you could go dunk, or any of your employees could go dunk from the 3-point line just because it was easy for him.
Right. Yeah, I like that metaphor. So, as we wrap up this segment, what are top 3 things? A lot of our listeners are with mid-sized companies, right? They're typically product marketing leaders, folks like that. They may not fully understand or have every kind of detail around like infrastructure or infrastructure as code. But for those individuals, what do you think are 3 things that they can take away from this conversation and put into practice tomorrow?
Wow.
Tough question.
Yeah, tough. I mean, I think that if I take a step back from this conversation and just say what I would like to see them take away is, I think number one, infrastructure shouldn't be viewed as a cost center. It is at the end of the day, and oftentimes even application development is viewed as a cost center. I mean, to me, it's table stakes, but also it can completely change the game in terms of what you are doing, the business that you're in. Yep. Netflix's investment in they invested in a lot of things and got a lot of things very, very right. But I would say that their investment in their infrastructure enabled them to completely change the game, and nobody has caught up. Everybody is hemorrhaging money trying to play catch up. Disney's nobody is making money streaming. While Netflix is counting the money and looking at their numbers grow. And I think that it isn't the beauty of modern infrastructure is that you don't have to make the capex that you had to make 15 years ago. Netflix showed us that, and now a lot of companies are leveraging the capital investment that was made by companies. There's really 3 of them, right? Google, Microsoft, and Amazon. So I would encourage people, yes, you can save money with those platforms, and you can avoid the massive CapEx infrastructure that needs to be made, but you still need to treat it as a first-class citizen, like you would your user experience, like you would your customer support, your customer success. To me, that's the number one thing that I hope people take away from our conversation, is that infrastructure is very important. The second thing that I would point out, I think in terms of cybersecurity, I still think that we are woefully reactive as a society. I think that every single cybersecurity breach that comes out seems, God, how did it get this big? How is it even bigger than the last one? How did this happen? And to me, it always comes back to, you're putting your entire business online. This doesn't just happen overnight. You have to get out of the reactive mode. You have to be thinking about it, cybersecurity in particular, beforehand. And the good news is there have been a lot of companies who have done a lot of really good work and made things open source, and it's easier than ever to be good at cybersecurity. We just, for whatever reason, don't have a security mindset as American businesses, at least. That would be my second takeaway. And then I think a third takeaway, we haven't really talked about it very much. I think I mentioned a little bit application development using tools like Cursor. Cursor's one that I like to talk about, but there's lots and lots of tools that people are using right now. And I just hope that people, and they're great tools. I think that they should be used in 100% of anything that I ever build. It would be like, I'm not going to write a piece of marketing copy without consulting ChatGPT or Perplexity or something.
Right.
It needs to be, but it's only a tool. And I tell people the number one cost or the main drivers of costs have not had anything to do with your coding costs in a very long time. And while I think it's great what you get from these tools, and I think that even before it was large language models doing it, when you had low code and no code tools doing it, or even offshore is a flavor of that as well. That's great, and you should use those tools, but that's not been where you've been spending your money over the last 20 years. I think that thinking about the big picture And if anything, building certain things with an AI generating it creates a completely different type of technical debt that nobody's talking about yet because the tools are so new, but it's going to be even more of a headache.
Yep.
So I think that, yes, all of these great tools that tech is giving us are wonderful, but I think that we just need to have a little bit of perspective on how to balance, because at the end of the day, you're going to have infrastructure, user experience, application development. All of them need to be really equal citizens in this. If all you do is focus on, well, I can go automate the code, that's great, but not the problems or the challenges that you're going to face are a little less obvious than localhost 3030, right? There's just all sorts of other things that go into the whole process.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, so as we wrap up, like, just where folks can find you online.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm on Twitter. I'm not very active. I mostly read on Twitter. But I'm JSB713. You can go to defiancedigital.com is our website. And you can follow us on LinkedIn as well, Defiance Digital. We're pretty committed to putting out solid content. If you're in the world of DevOps or cybersecurity or cloud infrastructure, definitely check us out. And we do events with other entrepreneurs like yourself as well, but all of that gets updated on LinkedIn.
Yeah. John, this has been awesome. Thank you for being on the show. I appreciate it, man.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it.
So, folks, you can find me, drewburdick.com or at Drew H. Burdick, pretty much on every social channel. Going to be doing more of these podcast episodes. If you haven't already, click subscribe, like, all the things on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all of that. Yeah, if you have a desire or an interest to be on the show, or if you have anything that you think you would be interesting to talk about, shoot me a note. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Drew.